I want to tell you about a toolkit that our organization put together that's very similar to the work that Luis just spoke about. It's a Forest Climate Communities toolkit. I would say that when I came back from the Bali Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC, I was very excited and enthusiastic about the prospects for REDD. As were most of the colleagues within my organization and within other organizations, and I imagine yours were too. And one of the things that we found was that our country teams didn't really know a lot about REDD. And so we started immediately working to try to help educate our own organization staff about carbon and carbon markets and climate change and REDD. And I think since that time, most of the capacity building has really been oriented on practitioners and policymakers and people within organizations, and a lot less at the level of communities and indigenous peoples and landowners. And so the people closest to the forest were really the ones receiving the least amount of attention when it came to training. And we felt that in this absence of community level training on REDD, that there was a real gap, and probably was around the same time that Conservation International and many others also, felt the same needs. So we wanted to address this by putting together an interactive and educational toolkit that would work with communities and it would work with concepts of climate change and carbon and relate it back to their own lives. We wanted to create a course that could be implemented basically at the level of a 7-year-old or a 70-year-old, understanding that people and communities would have different levels of education, different orientations and backgrounds. We wanted to be able to reach out to them in ways that were non-formal education techniques. We set ourselves some goals that in order for any type of education or training program to work, we had to have strong relationships with local partners, whether that be school systems, teachers, local NGOs, village leaders, etc. Those were the types of people we were building this tool for. We wanted to create an opportunity for open discussions and exchanges where people would get these new techniques, new concepts, and even new jargon that they'd be able to share between themselves on it and build their own community awareness and help them understand the opportunities and also the challenges around REDD. So what we did is create a tool, it's a curricula, it's a manual that basically will allow educators or teachers or trainers to engage different community members, leaders, students, and other educators. So we divided our toolkit into 2 guidebooks. One is designed to help a village leader or a community leader provide the training to other members in their community. And the other guidebook is designed for an educator, so a school teacher primarily, who would then be able to use it to teach in classrooms. We've also used the trainer of trainer or train the leader approach so that we could scale up the impacts of who's being trained. Very much like what Luis presented, the modules and the coursework are built around basic activities covering a number of different thematic areas, from the basics of climate, about the carbon cycle, the relationship of trees and carbon, forests and carbon, how forests are changing, and what investments in carbon and payments for environmental service and standards and things like that are actually about. And so every section of the toolkit has a number of activities where people can get hands-on, practical, interactive opportunities to to understand certain things. So we'll talk about the differences between weather and climate, what CO2 is, what gases are. Something that's probably pretty challenging for some peoples who maybe don't think at a molecular level to try to grasp what a gas is. We allow people to work together to do an activity where they map out the changes in the Earth's atmosphere over time, and to interview family members or elders in the community how they see local climate changes happening. We do another activity which is about the carbon cycle. It's somewhat of a game where people can really try to map out where carbon is going, because as we know, carbon is not destroyed, it's conserved and it has to be recycled. And we have this cycle that moves carbon between pools. We also allow people to have an opportunity to get out and to measure trees, and in understanding the techniques of measurement of trees, they start to understand a little bit more about the valuable role trees play as saints. We talk about the relationship that people have with their own forests, and so the particular country in which we're doing the training will have elements that have been tailored for their own forest dynamics. Think about ways that forests can be managed more sustainably, or are already managed more sustainably. And we talk about the investments in carbon and what this can mean. So in our implementation of this toolkit, we have worked in 3 distinct places. In Guatemala, we've done 19 carbon forestry workshops targeting community groups and leaders. We had 480 community members participate in awareness-raising workshops, and this has also been taken up by a local association of forest communities in Baten to do training with village members in their locality. In Ghana, we've worked with 36 different communities in a particular landscape, training so far about 150 different people, from farmers, local leaders, and youths. Looking a little bit more in their case at the changes happening at the interface between cocoa farming and rainforests that surround them, and the impacts of a changing climate. And then we've worked in the Mosquitia region of Honduras, adapting the toolkit with a local partner, Mopawi, to provide training in Honduras. In the adaptation process, there are a number of key factors for us. Translating into local languages is important, and being sensitive to what some languages what terms may mean in those languages is important. In Ghana, we found out that the language, Twi language, carbon dioxide is translated as bad air. That's interesting. We have to address the fact that people don't all read and write, so you have to create images, maps, graphs, figures, things that will allow people who are more visual in the way they think than literal. Have to make the topic locally relevant, as Jada was saying, has to have local sabor, local flavor to be attractive. I think that's really important. There has to be that relevancy and pertinence in people's lives. Very simple explanations of things is so important. Putting the information in non-technical language. We want the tools to be useful for multiple stakeholders. So by having an educator and a community leader guide, we can reach different audiences and have the scaling up take place with different people. And there's a lot of dynamic activities, visual, hands-on opportunities for individualized learning, group work, writing, playing, analyzing information, experimentation, graphs, et cetera, so that people are actually learning by doing things. And then we receive feedback after the workshops, so we can try to improve this work. So far, I think the outcomes that we've had is that we've been reaching a number of community stakeholders and helping them to be better informed about the basic climate issues that they may need if they are to participate more broadly in dialogues and discussions on RED. We feel like we've made some initial steps at addressing those gaps that I mentioned into the fact that RED education and RED training is now becoming more accessible at a community level. I think we're seeing that within communities and within teachers particularly, there's a lot of excitement and interest in using these types of manuals, and I think because they are at a level that can be easily replicated. And I think this type of education and training has helped to lay a little bit of the foundation for the more complex discussions on RED. But we do need to be realistic and understand that these basic types of education and training are no substitute for a lot more complex thought, complex dialogue, and more challenging issues that need to be resolved. So I think I'll close on that. If there's any questions, be happy to entertain them.
Any questions for Jeff?
Thanks, Jeff. It was interesting to see photos of you taking people out and getting them measuring trees. That was a way of helping to understand the idea of carbon and carbon volume. That's been done a few times, I think, in Indonesia, and one of the impacts of that is it leads directly to people thinking about money, because you're talking about a volume of carbon, and then in people's minds, I think inevitably, whatever you do to stop it, it gets turned into a figure for dollars. So I'm just interested to know how you deal with that issue of raising expectations or managing expectations from REDD.
Yeah, I think that's bound to be the case. The section that we have in on investing in carbon and carbon markets and carbon standards is very simplistic and tries to have a number of caveats that help to maintain expectations and perhaps even lower them. It's also complicated because once you start talking about the volume of carbon within a tree, then you have to start talking about baselines and reference levels, and then you have to start talking about additionality, and then you have to start talking about project emissions versus emission reductions, and all of a sudden you start opening yourself up to the entire suite of complexity of carbon accounting. So I think we just have to try to say that a tree has a value, and it may have a value as timber, it may have a value for fruit, it may have a value for fodder, it may have a value for fence posts or firewood, and it may have a value for carbon. And all of those values potentially are market or non-market values, and depending on how you choose to utilize them and depending on what the market will bear, you may have an opportunity there, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves in terms of calculating a windfall from carbon. You're so right. It's a very touchy subject.
Actually, my question relates to money as well, funny enough. I was just interested that the Money Rainforest Alliance does the majority of your income comes from the brands that you work with, like, sustainable coconut or tea or anything? Really, I'm just interested how it works.
Yeah, I'd have to look at our annual report to really give you the breakdown of where our $48 million budget comes from, but my guess is that probably 20% 20 to 25% might come from certification and use of seal fees, and the rest of it comes from corporate giving, foundations, government grants, major gifts, events, things like that. All of this stuff that I was talking about, this climate toolkit, however, has been funded by the Ashton Trust, which is a charity or foundation from the UK, and I think somewhere in the neighborhood of £25,000, £30,000, I don't know. It wasn't a huge grant.
Any other question?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Now we have opportunity to have a presentation from Ramiro Batzin. Ramiro Batzin is Maya Cachiquel from Guatemala, and he is the director of Tzotzil Association. So thank you, Ramiro.
Bueno, buenas tardes. Voy a hablar en español, entonces vamos a esperar para tener la traducción. Gracias. Bueno, comentarles sobre el proceso de capacitación que estamos desarrollando con el tema de cambio climático y pueblos indígenas en Guatemala. Este es un proceso que hemos venido desarrollando con el apoyo de Conservación Internacional y el Banco Mundial. Hemos venido planteando, digamos, la necesidad de tener una metodología de capacitación que pueda permitir a los pueblos indígenas tener toda la información sobre el tema de cambio climático y red, pero al mismo tiempo también fortalecer el tema de sus derechos y el tema de sus modelos propios de gobernanza y administración de bosques. Para iniciar, digamos, Tzotzil es parte de lo que es la Mesa Indígena de Cambio Climático en Guatemala. Esta es una instancia que se constituye a raíz de que el gobierno de Guatemala inicia a desarrollar acciones en el tema de cambio climático y estaba dejando fuera el abordaje de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Son alrededor en este momento de 20 organizaciones indígenas que nos hemos aglutinado. Tzotzil tiene la coordinación de la mesa en estos momentos y la mesa ha desarrollado un plan de trabajo y ha desarrollado una planeación estratégica de 10 años para abordar los temas a nivel internacional, a nivel nacional y a nivel local. Hablarles en estos momentos, digamos, que se ha definido hacer un proceso sobre el cambio climático en los pueblos indígenas en 3 áreas específicamente. Sí, en los procesos de adaptación, en los procesos de mitigación, específicamente en el tema de red, y en los procesos de transferencia tecnológica y conocimiento tradicional. El tema del conocimiento tradicional aborda a todos los ejes de forma transversal. ¿Sí? En los procesos de adaptación al cambio climático se ha desarrollado, o iniciamos prácticamente, digamos, donde vamos a trabajar en cada una de las comunidades o regiones, realizando un estudio comunitario participativo sobre los impactos del cambio climático. Aquí se identifican, digamos, elementos como salud, seguridad alimentaria, vulnerabilidad, cultura. Cada una de las comunidades hace un análisis sobre cómo son afectados en este momento. Hace un análisis, lo que le llamamos, digamos, el pasado, presente y futuro. ¿Cómo estuvo la comunidad, digamos, en el pasado? Estamos teniendo una media de 100 y 50 años atrás que pueda decir la comunidad cómo ha estado en relación al cambio climático, cómo está actualmente y cómo creen que van a estar, digamos, en los próximos 20 o 30 años en este tema. Actualmente se han desarrollado 2 estudios, uno en la región Cachiquel, donde se analizó el impacto en la cultura específicamente. Se ha hablado mucho de los impactos, digamos, en salud, en seguridad alimentaria, pero no así en la cultura. Entonces se hace un análisis desde la parte espiritual, cómo el cambio climático está afectando, digamos, ese corazón de la cultura que es la espiritualidad maya en este caso. Esto lo hemos desarrollado, digamos, en el marco del Uxlahu Huactum o el cambio de era del 2012. Luego hemos desarrollado en la región Quechín un estudio precisamente sobre seguridad alimentaria, en el tema de maíz, en el tema de frijol, que digamos los hermanos quechís están teniendo un impacto fuertemente. Entonces estos estudios permiten saber cómo ha estado, cómo está y cómo estará la comunidad frente a estos impactos. Esto se hace desde una metodología participativa comunitaria en los propios idiomas, con elementos culturales, con facilitadores directamente de las comunidades. Se identifican o se han identificado, podríamos decir, como 3 bloques, que son acciones de planificación, ¿sí? Primero, se hace todo el proceso de planificación que debería de contener para atender estas necesidades. Acciones de atención directamente, que es lo que la comunidad pide, ¿sí? Cuáles son las acciones que la comunidad dice deben de atender, y aquí están, por ejemplo, en los procesos de vulnerabilidad, digamos, la atención inmediata y la atención previa, ¿sí?